Hey, College Success! Welcome to week 5 of your summer semester, which now means you're officially halfway through the summer course. So week 5 runs from July 5th through the 11th, so we're going to jump right in. I'm going to scroll on down to week 5. You can see that we are in chapters 7 and 8 this week. So chapters 7 and 8 is what I'm going to lecture over, and then you'll have assignments from both of those chapters, as you can see here, and on your syllabus. So again, back to, you have 2 discussion forums, so keep that in mind, a chapter 7 discussion and a chapter 8 discussion. Needing to post your original response in both of those for week 5 attendance. Again, if you only post in one and not the other, that is 50% attendance. And then if you post late, it'll be 50% attendance as well. So let's go ahead and get into the materials. And we're going to pull up, I can already have chapter 7 text up there running, so I'm just going to pull up the slides and start going through these and reference the text as needed. All right, so chapter 7 is on thinking, and the reason it's so vague is because it's on different types of thinking, as you can see here. Creative, analytical, critical, problem solving, metacognition, information literacy. So lots of different types of thinking. So here is that pre-survey, the questions that you can answer. Again, either now if you like to do it now, or if you actually like to go in the survey itself in the assignment area, you can take it there. All right, so here are all the reasons and all the things that the goals of this chapter. You're going to talk about thinking as a process, why creative thinking is important, as well as critical thinking, analytical thinking, all the components of these different types of thinking, what metacognition is, and information literacy, especially as it relates to you as a college student. Okay, so here are some resources, just kind of a lot of research will say, especially coming out of MIT and places like that, we want to keep our brain sharp. So lots of mind puzzles and thinking games. So those are just a couple quick examples. So creative thinking, here's that section 7.2 wants to know, how do you generate ideas? What's the best way to come up with these ideas? And for some of you, creative thinking will be more important than others, depending on the field that you're going into, but creative thinking will play a role, hopefully, regardless where you are in your career. So creative thinking is just trying to help you be more creative, think of ideas more clearly, problem solve, and how you want to think of this is, what ways could thinking creatively help you as a student? And one of your assignments this week in Chapter 7, your Chapter 7 assignment is a creative thinking assignment. So you'll see that in action here shortly. So creativity is one of the highest level of thinking skills. If this looks familiar to you, this is Bloom's. I think we talked about this in a previous chapter, but Bloom's taxonomy. And you can see there was an older version, which I'm not even aware of any textbooks that still have this printed in them. This is the one that I'm familiar with. So these are the different levels of thinking, and on the top is creation, creating. Creative thinking is one of the highest forms of thinking, according to Bloom's, and according to a lot of other, fields of research that look at the levels of thinking. Okay? So there's a lot of quotes in here about creative thinking. But again, what is creative thinking? So creative thinking is going to help us outside the box. That's kind of what I think of when I think of creative thinking, thinking outside the proverbial box. And so a lot of fields will rely on creative thinking to come up and problem solve things that have been an issue in the field for a long time. This is a quote you're going to come back to. One of your quiz questions is going to talk about this. There is no such thing as a new idea. So I want you to kind of be thinking of that. Do you believe this quote? Do you think it's true? If so, why? If not, why? There's no such thing as a new idea. And you'll see this in chapter 7. When you're in chapter 7 and it goes through the thinking, it's going to tell you more again about what thinking means. Here are some questions that have to do with thinking. Some analysis questions. There's that Bloom's taxonomy again, talking about generating new ideas. And here's a little bit more of that context of that quote. There is no such thing as a new idea. It is impossible We simply take a lot of old ideas and put them into a sort of mental kaleidoscope. We give them a turn and they make new and curious combinations. We keep on turning and making new combinations indefinitely, but they are the same old pieces of colored glass that have been in use through all the ages. So I've heard this quote from Mark Twain before, and I always think it's an interesting one to kind of reflect upon. And so you're going to get a chance to really think about that quote as well. So, generating new and original ideas. So how do you do that? One of the ways to enhance creativity is to track your ideas. So that some people will say that kind of hampers creative thinking if you have to jot down what you're thinking of it. But really kind of making sure that you are writing down your ideas as they come to you, or even, a little bit later, but just keeping track of them. Some people use like visual methods to keep track of their ideas. Now, part of, as I said, creative thinking is thinking outside the box or thinking about things in an unconventional way. And some people are not used to that. They're very conventional. And so unconventional or creative thinking can produce some anxiety or some resistance to some people. And so you have to kind of be aware of that. If you're in a place where you work with people or you go to school with people where creative thinking makes them uncomfortable, you can kind of expect some resistance from that. Here's one of my favorite things. And I say that in jest because this happens in the workplace, whether you're like in a school setting, in a work setting, in a setting with friends. We've always done it this way. That is like an excuse that a lot of people use. Excuse me. That a lot of people use to not try something new because they don't want to take risks. So because we've always done it that way is kind of a way to shoot down creative thinking. And so that's one hurdle that creative thinking has to get over is, okay, we've always done it this way, but does that mean it's the best way? So other ways, things to think about when you're talking about unconventional or thinking outside the box is making sure that you can clearly communicate your thinking, making sure that you're surrounding yourself with other creative thinkers. Sometimes other people can squash your creativity. So it's helpful to be around people who can support your creative thinking. Okay, so that's a little bit about creative thinking. We also, in our lives, not only as college students, but we want to be analytical with our thinking. We want to look at how we can analyze information to really systematically understand what's happening. So when we analyze things, basically what we're doing is looking at the parts, using information literacy, and then validating, and checking different sources that you have used. And they give the example of like working in a warehouse. They have a lot of complex problem solving and how to kind of work within a specific system. So how do you look at different parts? So they use this example in our chapter about looking at a research paper. And how can you analyze a research paper? Well, it goes through, coming up with a list of tasks you have to complete, coming up with, if you encounter any obstacles, what do you do? So this is an example of how you can analyze a pretty large problem, in this case, a research paper, and how you can break it down into different pieces. And this is analytical thinking, looking at something that is going to force you to look at the pieces and the parts that come together for a whole piece. You have to come up with ideas, topics, thesis statements, outlines, drafting, editing, revising. All of those things go into the bigger problem, in this case, the research paper. That's an example of analysis. And they give some more examples of, Henry Ford and Frederick Smith and how they had to use analytical thinking in their line of work. Okay, from there, our chapter talks about critical thinking, which again, as a college student, and really just as a person in general, but as a college student, you really do need to be critical in your thinking. You need to dig deeper. You should not always take things for face value, which means that you really need to look at how the information is being presented. Is it biased? Are you biased when you read the information? So all of these things play a role in the critical thinking, and knowing the difference between facts and opinions is kind of the basis of a lot of the critical thinking. So, here's an example of how we use critical thinking just in our daily lives. We might make decisions that involve a little bit of critical thinking every day, whether we realize it or not. We also use critical thinking in our problem solving. So problem solving involves critical thinking because hopefully when you're thinking about a problem, you're thinking through different pieces of the problem. You're not just going to solve kind of on a whim. So you're going to, look at the questions, gather research, understand all the options, evaluate the decision you make. So here are kind of, again, going into more depth about determining problems and how you can look at that. What I would like to spend a little bit of time on here is kind of this idea of bias. And so not only do we have bias, which we talked about this in a previous week, being aware of your own bias and how that can impact the way that you view certain subjects or classes or people. It's also making sure that you're not bringing bias with you to something that you read, but also identifying when an author has bias. And a lot of you did a great job with this when you had the 7 deadly sins of students. You recognized that there was some bias in there. So whenever you're reading something, you really do want to be able to determine, is this author biased? Because if an author is biased and you can't pick up on it, they might they might influence your thinking without even knowing it. So you want to look at bias and look to see, are they using facts? Are they using opinions? Are they only presenting one side of the story? So facts are verifiable, meaning they can prove them true or false, because false facts are a thing. You can prove a fact false. Opinions are beliefs. There's no supporting evidence. It's a value judgment. This talks a little bit more, facts can be verified through observation or research. When I said false fact, I mean, think about, not so long ago in the course of our human history, people believed that the earth was flat. That was a fact. Well, we have since come out, through different ways of researching and observation, proven that the earth is not flat. That doesn't just make that fact go away. It becomes a false fact. It has since been proven false. So facts can be proven true or false through some sort of measurement or observation. And then an opinion, on the other hand, again, is just someone's personal belief, their attitude. And a lot of times there are people who will try to put their opinion out there as if it's fact. This happens a lot in politics, unfortunately. A lot of politicians, almost probably every politician, will put their opinion forward as if it's fact. But you have to be really careful that your own bias or their bias does not influence your thinking, and you can evaluate to see, is this a belief? Is this an opinion? Is this an assumption? If not, can we prove it true or false? So again, critical thinking leads into problem solving, making sure that you are looking at different ways and approaches to generate solutions to problems. So here are the steps that many people will say are like very helpful in making an informed decision. So first, determine the issue. So I don't know, maybe think about a decision you already made, so that way you already know the outcome. Like, so you had a problem on whether to come to Stark State or not. So obviously you're here, so you decided. But here's the issue: where to go to school. Recognize other perspectives. Okay, I could go to school, I could get a job, I could go to the military, I can take a year off. So like different perspectives. Think of multiple possible results. Like, okay, well, what would happen if I went to school right now? What would happen if I went into just a job for now? Research and evaluate the possibilities. So maybe you're kind of thinking, okay, well, really I'm weighing back and forth between going to school at Sark State or taking a year off and working before I go to school. So really look into those possibilities. What's the benefit of going to school now versus going to school a year from now? Select the best results, communicate your findings, and then put that into action. And something that is not right here that I want to kind of make sure I talk about is reflect on that choice. Was it the right choice for you? You're here now. Was it the right thing to do? So problem solving, just because you make a decision and you go through this problem solving process, you go through this critical thinking process, doesn't always mean you might make the right decision, because you still have to reflect on it and see, did you do the right thing? And then problem solving could use critical thinking, creative thinking, analytical thinking. So lots of different ways to kind of approach problem solving. And part of that, again, we kind of touched on this, is looking at multiple solutions. Sometimes there might be a couple different solutions to a problem, but one path may work the best. If that's the case, why not? The next section talks about metacognition, and metacognition is simply just thinking about your thinking. being aware of your thinking. So knowing why you believe and think the way you do, being aware of these things, as this next quote talks about, is a sign of mature thinking. And so what is, again, metacognition? It's being aware of your thinking and thinking deliberately. You plan, you track, you assess. I'll give an example. I had a student who one semester was failing just every vocabulary quiz she took in one of my other classes. And I asked her, I said, well, how do you study? And she goes, well, I just use flashcards. And I said, well, have you ever thought about it's the flashcard method? And she never really thought about the fact that flashcards were just not the most productive way for her. So she really started to reflect on what she was doing and how that was not producing the results that she wanted. And so she changed the way she approached her studying, and she started to see better results. So she started to think about her thinking processes. She started to approach it in a different way. She started to pay attention to how her results were compared to what they were before and assess if it was a better approach. She started doing like practice quizzes and studying with a partner. So just being aware of your thinking is going to assist you overall. Finally, here in this kind of last section, talks about information literacy. It's just knowing about source validity. How do you find information that you need and then evaluate if that information is credible, if it's, reliable? Where do you go to get this information? I'm going to show you real quickly here in a few minutes as well, part of our Stark State built-in system to help you with this. So information literacy, again, it goes back to looking to see, how to access information, knowing how to get to that access. I often have students who, believe it or not, my younger students are the ones who struggle the most with this. A lot of people have this assumption that older students maybe struggle with technology, but that's not necessarily the case. It's the type of technology that I see the struggle is different. My younger students struggle with this part right here, information literacy. They know how to use technology. They know how to use social media and different apps and different programming and things like that, but sometimes they struggle with finding information that is reliable and credible. Google is like a real quick go-to, and Google's not always your best friend for these things. So knowing where to get the sources you need and how to evaluate those sources is all part of information literacy. And so this talks about, you need to make sure that you're finding, again, reliable sources that have been checked, that is unbiased, that might be a scholarly article, it might be a website, it just depends on maybe whatever project you're working on. So this section here, you can see it kind of gives you a figure of a snippet of an article. How are you going to find these reliable sources? And this is a little bit larger in this section here. You can see that it's blown up here a little bit more. So how do you know how to get to these particular sources? And if you haven't seen something like this before, you're probably already familiar with most of these domains, .edu, .com, .gov, .org, .net. .biz is one that you don't see quite as often. But knowing, first of all, if you have a website address, what website address is going to be most reliable. So oftentimes people think that .edu is the most reliable source, and it might not be, because .edu might be just the educational institution, like Ohio State. It's a great institution, but it might not give you the information you're looking for because it might be trying to sell you on a program, to take at their institution. Oftentimes you want to rely on like the .orgs, the .govs, maybe the .nets. .coms are usually one of the last ones you want to look for in terms of finding like scholarly or very credible sources. Not that there's not credible sources on .coms. You just have to do a little bit more background work to make sure that they are. On our Stark State homepage where it says, I'm down at the very bottom here, digital library, I can show you that here in our digital library, I'm going to go ahead and get into a database by subject. I'm just going to click on, for right now, education. I'm going to go in here. This is a research database. Inside this research database, this does, because I'm off campus, it's going to make me log in. This does a lot of the work for me. This helps me find scholarly or even popular sources, but they've already been kind of proofed for me. I already know that these are reliable sources. So this is a great place if you're not familiar with it already to become familiar with it, because odds are if you haven't had to use the digital library yet in another course, you will have to at some point. But this is a great place to find these reliable sources. As we talked about here, verifying validity, making sure that you know. So if you're not going through like a school website, a school database, and you're just on the open web or you're on a different platform, you really should be looking at things like this. Like if you're looking at a website, whether it's .com or even .org, just know who owns the site. Is it an organization? Is it a person? When was it written? What's the domain? So, what was the purpose? Is there any bias? Are they trying to sell me anything? All those things are going to help you understand how valid and credible that particular source is. Again, here's that little table there. Wrapping up, also making sure that as you are gathering information, that you manage those, that you put them in a system that's going to work for you. Anytime I do, again, kind of like back here, anytime I do a search in these databases, I always keep a paper trail, like a literal paper trail. I write it down, like here are the keywords I used, here are the sources I found, so that I have a nice management, and that's going to help me not only in my searching process, but then eventually in my reference process, keeping track of that. Okay, so that's the gist of Chapter 7, and again, as always, I really recommend you going in and kind of looking at these sections of Chapter 7. Maybe you feel like creative thinking is a weakness of yours, so you really want to take some more time and read more about creative thinking, or maybe problem solving is an area that you need to brush up on. So I really do encourage you to go back into these sections and spend a little bit more time on those particular sections. All right, now let's go ahead and take a look at Chapter 8. Chapter 8 up and running right here as well. Okay, Chapter 8, communicating. So here is the kind of outline of what we're going to talk about with communication. Here is that pre-survey. How do you feel about communication in these areas? So communication, I like this quote again. The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. Have you ever had kind of a miscommunication with someone, and the problem really was you were saying one thing and the other person was saying something else, and you both thought you were on the same page, but really neither of you were? That's a good example of miscommunication. So that's kind of like that quote for that purpose. So here are the things that this chapter will talk about, the different variables to communication, why we communicate, the role of technology, which I think is really interesting as well, barriers and context of communication. So here's the overview of communication. Starts off with defining communication, two different ways. A process by which information is exchanged with a common system of symbols, signs, or behavior. And then the giving, receiving, or exchanging of ideas, information, signals, or messages. I think those definitions really kind of capture it pretty well. I like this one right here. So technology has created new rules for communication. You've probably seen like this example before, or maybe other examples of, like kind of funny text exchanges where it really wasn't communicated well with the other person. But communication, technology in particular, has really changed the way that we communicate. So when we communicate, whether it is through technology or verbal or written, first you have to keep in mind, who are you talking to? To whom are you talking? What's your audience? Why are you talking to this person, and what's your goal? So these are the things that should be in mind, even if it's kind of just more casual communication. Knowing who you're talking to and what you're hoping to get out of it is helpful in just a conversation between friends. Also, listening. We talked a little bit about this with active listening. Communication is a two-way street. So you can't just be waiting for your turn to talk. You should also be really engaged in what the person is saying. And then if you need to respond, that way you've really actively listened and you're not just waiting to talk. Okay? So what is the purpose of communication? When you're writing academically, when you're writing even just for an email, whatever it might be, does everything you say or write have a purpose? Why are you writing this? What's the purpose? Do you expect a response from this particular communication? And do you need to change how you communicate depending on the response that you get? Mark Twain, it's real heavy in this book, man. Mark Twain, the difference between the right word and almost the right word is the difference between lightning and the lightning bug. So I think this really comes into play with written communication. Sometimes I feel like over online or even just, writing letters, whatever the case is, we have to really be careful with the words that we use. We need to make sure that we're using the correct words. So again, thinking about our purpose of communication. Communication and technology. So we want to think about how technology has changed the way we communicate. So is technology vital to your ability to communicate well? Are there rules to follow when communicating online? And how do you control your online communication? So you've probably heard of netiquette before already. And here, if you haven't, netiquette is kind of the etiquette of online communication. So you want to make sure that you're not typing in all caps. My mother does this. I think I finally got her to break this habit, but she's not a social media user. She refuses for years, and her emails are usually in all caps. I have to keep telling her, Mother, you're yelling at people when you do that. So sometimes people aren't always aware of that. So just being aware that all caps are usually interpreted as screaming. You just want to be polite when you're communicating online. Apologize if someone takes what you have written in a way that you did not intend. If you've ever seen this phrase before, IMHO, it really tries to communicate that you really are just expressing your opinion. It is your opinion so that you're not attacking someone. You want to make sure that the words you use are careful because people can't hear your tone of voice, and just be respectful of your audience. This right here, I'm going to bring this up over here. Actually, it's already up here because you're going to come back to this as well. So you're going to need to know this particular section here. We're in 8.3. So make sure you know where that is located. So this is Howard Rengold. It talks about the way that we use our use of communication and media in terms of these different literacy areas. So whenever we are interacting in an online environment, we need to ask ourselves these questions. First, do we know what's going on? How focused are we on who or what is around us, like in terms of the environment in which we're in online? Participation, how are we responding? Are you writing? Are you taking a vote? Are you sending pictures? Are you working with others in a technological way to communicate? Are you aware, again, of your interactions? Are other people involved in this? So this kind of, I think, goes with a couple other of them. Critical consumption. What messages are flowing to you? How reliable are those? This goes back to that literacy part, right? That information literacy, looking at the validity, reliability. So this is kind of a new way to think about it, because even though this was done in the early 90s, this is still something to think about, still something to be aware of when it comes to interacting online. Okay, coming down here. So again, network awareness. Do you follow influencers? What is their impact on you? Even if you don't follow an influencer, quote unquote, is how it's used oftentimes today, how you consume information online could influence you. So how much do you allow what you read online to influence you? Making sure that you change the way you communicate to the way that technology is changing as well. So these are some examples, there's no tone of voice when you're texting. You can't use hand gestures when you use phone conversations. So just making sure that you are aware of those things when you're communicating online. And here are, again, some more resources on fact-checking and social networking. Addiction, that's a thing. People are addicted to social media, and you maybe know someone like that. All right, so the rest of this starts going into, again, the context of communication, knowing how communication should change in different situations. How does your listening change in different situations? Do you change the way you talk and communicate based on the people that you're with? And you probably do. Most of us do. It's called code switching. We might talk and behave a certain way with people in our family, and then change the way we talk and behave when we are in the professional setting or with friends, or whatever the case is. So just being aware of those things. Also, part of communication is knowing about emotional intelligence, recognizing your own emotions and how you react to things, as well as being able to recognize the emotions of others is going to help with communication purposes. We already talked about how listening is a part of communication. And then the rest of the chapter talks about kind of these barriers to communication. What are some barriers? Well, it ties into our last chapter, some biases, so some preconceptions and assumptions. So what are your preconceptions? Are you thinking about something? Are you assuming something about someone before you even begin talking to them? So you want to be aware of those biases. And then what are some other barriers with communication? So these are just some of many different barriers that you could have to take into consideration based on your audience, based on your purpose. All of those things could play a role. All right, and there's that post. Again, I encourage you to really take a look in here in chapter 8 and look to see what it is you need to spend more time with in terms of communication. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and scroll up and I'm going to start talking to you about your assignments. So week 5 assignments. There's your pre and post. Again, self-reflection for your chapter 7. Here is your chapter 7 discussion. Remember, you're posting in this and the chapter 8 by Wednesday for week 5 attendance. So here is your prompt. Some people say creativity is the realm of children. Some people think that creative thinking is just for kids. Can you think of how a child's curiosity and willingness to explore may help you understand a college discipline that is unfamiliar to you now? So write a reflection on how you could use curiosity toward one of your most difficult college courses in college. So I'll give a quick example. I have a colleague here at the college that he would come around to speak to classes and talk about approach college like a 5-year-old, because 5-year-olds and really young children in general always ask why, and they're very creative in their thinking. And as college students, we want to do the same thing. We want to ask why, we want to be creative. And so this is kind of tying that in. How can you use kind of creative thinking and curiosity to help you in your college courses? Whether that's maybe a college course you're taking right now, or maybe you know there's a course on the horizon that might be challenging for you. How could creative thinking play a role in that? All right, so again, original response by Wednesday, respond to 2 student posts by Sunday. Here is your chapter 7 assignment. Remember I said you would have a creative thinking assignment. Now you might think it's a little strange. I did too when my coordinator first showed me this assignment, but it definitely is a creative thinking assignment. So here you go. Here's the issue. It says you have to think about this issue. Your institution, so think about Stark State, or if you're currently a high school student, you can think about your high school, has cut funding to the library, tutoring center, and the wellness center, effective immediately. You know very well that you and your fellow students' success will suffer because you will not be able to access these important services. What would you do? So before you think about what you would do, think about all these other people. So what would Bugs Bunny do? How would he solve this problem? What would Oprah do? What would Bill Gates do? Go all the way down. If you're not sure who some of these people are, I think most of them are familiar in pop culture or in recent political conversations, but always feel free to do like a quick Google search if you need to. And then just think about what would that person do? And I'm not looking for a ton, a sentence or 2. What would this person do? And then of the potential solutions, what are the most realistic? So obviously I'm going to go ahead and venture to say Bugs Bunny may not have a realistic solution. What are the most exciting? He might have the most exciting solution though. I don't know. So it depends on what you put. So which are the most realistic? Which are the most exciting? Okay. And so that's what you're going to respond there after you have plugged in all of these things. Okay. So that is a creative thinking. So you won't have a chance in here to say what you would actually do. So no pressure. You don't have to think about how you would do it. What would all these people do? And once you get that, you'll go ahead and submit it, and that is due by Sunday. All right, your chapter 7 quiz. Get that pulled up. Here are your questions. So this talks about creative thinkers and having an open mind and how important being open-minded is in terms of creative thinking. So it's asking, do you think you're a creative thinker or not? And then have you had any kind of situations recently where you had to question your open-mindedness? Here is that quote from Mark Twain, question 2. It says, do you agree or disagree with his quote when he said there's no such thing as a new idea? And then defend why you think so. Question 3 talks about this semester, or you can talk about maybe a previous semester, a previous academic experience. Have you tried doing anything in a different way than you've done? Like, have you changed things up? Or would you think about doing that? You know, if you tried doing different things differently in the past than what you've normally done, what was the outcome? Are you open-minded enough to change things up? So question 3 is kind of talking about that open-mindedness, changing your thinking and approaches. Question 4 talks about logical thinking to solve a conflict, and it says work, but I mean, think about if you can't think of a situation at work, think about school or family or friends. And then question 5 is about metacognition. So when were you aware about your thinking processes? So that's your chapter 7 quiz, and you'll submit that by Sunday as well. Okay. All right. There's your chapter 8 pre and post survey. Here's your chapter 8 discussion. Again, you have to respond to this one by Wednesday along with your chapter 7 for full week 5 attendance. Respond to 2 classmates by Sunday. Here's your prompt. Reflect outside your usual comfort zone and friend group. Think of someone with whom you disagree and think about how what they said had an effect on you. Did they use correct etiquette when saying what they said? If you respond, what would you do to make certain your response was heard correctly and was not offensive? So this is going back and thinking of netiquette. In particular, mostly, although it says etiquette, you can think about the online because that's what a lot of chapter 8 talked about if you want to think about etiquette or netiquette. So think about someone that's outside your close group. Think of someone that you disagree with, how they have said things that may have struck a chord with you. Were they polite or using etiquette when they said what they said that you disagreed with? How can you respond in a way that would not be offensive? And you don't have to give specific names, only if you're comfortable. Sometimes it's easy to think of maybe someone in the spotlight, to think of them. But again, we want to be polite in our own responses to our classmates as well. So respond in your original response by Wednesday. All right, chapter 8 assignment pulls up here. Communicating with a professor. It says, read the following communication examples from students to professors and rewrite them so they follow the rules that are described in chapter 8 communication. Meaning, are they using the proper kind of netiquette examples? Because this says this is through email and this is through text message. Or, going about it in a way that is appropriate for communication. So look at the 3 examples. This one is email, this one's text message, and this one is supposedly face-to-face. And you are going to rewrite it so that it is following proper communication. So you can do so if you want to open up a Word document, you can type it in there, or if you wanted to click right in here and under write submission, you could do 1, rewrite it there, 2, rewrite it there, 3, rewrite it there, and so on. So however you want to do that is up to you, and that is due by Sunday as well. All right, and finally, chapter 8 quiz. So here's your chapter 8 quiz. So this is talking about making a presentation about differences between everyday communication and college communication. So what would you include in a presentation like that? How would you compare and contrast those different types of communication? Here is that technology, Rengold's 5 literacies. So remember back in chapter 8, communication and technology. Oh, these ones right here. So if you need to review those again, thinking about those, what is your most and least developed area of media literacy? And give an example of each. So there's 5 of them. What is your most developed and what is your least developed of those 5? Question 3 talks about kind of active listening. How could you improve your listening and why and what strategies would you use? Question 4 is talking about barriers to communication and what do you need to consider when you realize you're not being understood? And then question 5 is kind of giving an example of how to communicate with a professor more effectively. So make sure you submit that by Sunday as well. Okay, quick recap in terms of all your assignments. You have chapter 7 and chapter 8 discussions due by Wednesday for week 5 attendance. Respond to 2 classmates in each by Sunday. And then also by Sunday, you want to do the creative thinking assignment, chapter 7 assignment, chapter 7 quiz, chapter 8 assignment on the communication, and chapter 8 quiz. If you have any questions, please let me know. Have a great week.